look, talking about love and kindness, shall we talk about today's big political issue, which is the economic response to COVID-19, or the economy in the light of, the shadow of COVID-19?
Now, everybody claims to be the best at handling the economy. The government, they're always saying, we'll leave the economy to us. The economy, we'll grow it. We'll grow it more. Well, we'll grow it even better than you, is sort of the argument. So this year, the economy's huge, right? Because economies all around the world have been really flipped on their head and things are changing in huge ways.
Yes, they have. And look, I have resisted trying to present too much political philosophy, but I think when it comes to talking about the economy, and it was certainly a big topic in the debate last night, if anybody was listening to the Christchurch debate, the economy was a big topic. Here's an important principle to remember, and to remember in all of what we're going to talk about this morning, is that the people are the economy. Right? The economy is not the share market, the stock market, it's not jobs, it's people. People are the most important thing. So, where we're going to start this morning. Exactly. You got it. People are the most important thing, and people are the economy. When we're talking about the economy, we are talking about people's ability to have a roof over their head, to put food on the table, to educate themselves, their children, to look after their friends, their whānau, their families. And so it's really important when we talk about the economy to not lose that connection with actual real people. So where we're going to start today, obviously, the lockdowns that we have all gone through as a team of 5.5, 6. I don't know where the number's settled yet in terms of exactly how many million New Zealanders there are. But the team has gone through these lockdowns together, and it's had a really big impact on our economy. It's meant jobs have been lost. It's meant that businesses have had to slow down and shut down. First up this morning, we're going to hear from somebody who has experienced that firsthand, Janina Kay.
I feel like we have sacrificed business for health, but when I stick my head up and see what's going around globally, I kind of go, oh, okay, maybe we were right. But as a person who has survived solely on the subsidies, and I've appreciated that, that's not business. And I have suffered because of the lockdowns. I have lost work, and I have spent 4 months of my life working 10 hours a week, and am only now just building up. But the stress of that is quite significant.
I think a lot of people will be able to relate to that. And they're like, that resonates with me. I'm in that exact same position.
Mm-hmm. And whether you are a business owner or an employee or somebody who's been impacted one way or the other, that's the reality. When the economy slows down, when the economy is brought to a halt, it stops. And the economy conversation this year is different to any other election that we've ever had, because this year it's been made, and I think unfairly so, it's been made a conversation about two ideals that should not be dichotomous. In other words, it's been health or the economy, and it shouldn't be that way, right? We have to figure out, how do we have an economy that can support and thrive and fund not just life and life in New Zealand the way we want it to be, but also paying back the cost of what it has been to actually keep people healthy. So I talked to a friend of mine who sits on the more progressive liberal side of things, who is also a business owner, which is important to note, Vincent Heringer. I talked to him about what might a progressive view of an economy look like in the future.
I think you want to do two things when you think about what we should do with COVID. The first is managing the crisis right now, and I don't think there are many people that would say that our government's got it horribly wrong. You know, saving people from illness and death is the first responsibility of any government. So points to the government for keeping COVID largely out of New Zealand. It's come at a cost. But one thing that hasn't been spoken about much is the cost of death is very high. You know, when the economic analysis of the Spanish flu was that the cities that kept death out of their cities were the ones that recovered fastest. And that's because the people dying is expensive. You lose economic manpower. And so keeping death and illness out of the country, that's got to be the first priority. But then once that's done, how do we use this as an opportunity to reimagine what kind of New Zealand we could have? So, this kind of phase of rescue, but also now into rebuild, is something we should all participate in. We should all have an opinion about, well, if we did rebuild our city, if there was a kind of reset, what kind of things would we do? Not just our city, our country. What sort of New Zealand, what sort of Aotearoa would we actually want? And, everyone will have an opinion about that. But why not? This is a great moment to have an opinion and look to your leaders, look to the government to articulate what kind of vision they have for a different kind of New Zealand, a different kind of place. Everyone will have their own agenda and their own point of view, but hold your leaders to account and say to them, actually, I don't just want a rescue plan, I want a reimagination plan, and the bolder the better, as far as I'm concerned. I'm a big fan. I go on about this, so do shoot me if you've heard this before. But New Zealand has to go from being a volume economy to a value economy. And you just think about it in two areas. Think about tourism. We've had so many cheap tourists come and flood New Zealand. And the outcome of that has been that we've not been able to keep up with our infrastructure. So that's not going to happen anymore. We're not going to get back quickly to a volume question around tourism. So how do we get value out of tourism? The same with our major industry, which is dairy. We've been down this volume business for so long, to the point now that we're putting dairy farms in really sensitive places like the Mackenzie country. It's complete madness. How do we shift that conversation? How do we shift that industry from a volume exercise to a value exercise, where we're producing more from less, and we're getting more from less? And it could be pharmaceuticals, it could be nutraceuticals, it could be different ways of doing genetics, it could be different grasses. What's New Zealand's contribution to regenerative farming? What's our contribution to producing cows and grasses that don't produce methane? Imagine that, So agri-tech, science, genetics, branded premium products that come from beautiful New Zealand. That's the kind of Aotearoa I want to work in and live in. We haven't even talked about the people, just industry so far, but I could go on. But I think the story of volume to value is the story that I want to see articulated by whatever government comes next.
Very interesting. And I like the points about value over volume. That's like I guess it makes sense to me now.
Well, it sounds great, right? But then how do you do it?
That's the thing.
Exactly.
And both political sides will promise you that they are the ones who can do it, and I guess someone's going to have to, because at the moment, the debt is sort of piling up there, as it is around the world for lots and lots of countries, right? Because they're having to borrow to keep themselves afloat. But then how long can you do that for?
Well, and you have to ask the question, exactly who is it that we're borrowing from?
I know! Who's got all this cash?
What's the interest rate on that borrowed money?
Well, you're going to
not
find
real
out in a
money.
few years, Leanna, when we're going to pay it all back. So that's the interesting one, right? Because everyone's borrowing all this money, and it's like this unprecedented time or whatever, and then figuring out how long can you do that for? How does it get paid back? Who has to pay it back? Best strategy for doing that. And then it's like, well, what about the next big thing that we have to go through? What if New Zealand has another huge earthquake that devastates? Like these things can cost. Like, what if this thing just keeps going on? Do we just keep borrowing? It's a hard one to figure out, right?
Absolutely. And if you consider both of those situations and stories that we heard, right? Because they're really stories that we heard this morning. There's a great big bridge that has to be built between the shock and the harshness and the reality of where we have been, where we are coming out of COVID-19, but the enormous opportunity and possibility. I think the reality is that the answer to your question, Bjorn, is that in order to prepare for the future, we do have to have a very different type of economic thinking than what we've currently had. So I think we can probably, talk about this around and around and for days, but, we'll give it a shot today and then people can make their decision. But I think the key thing is that when we are listening to the various political parties present their ideas, present their thoughts, I think that a really useful way of thinking about how you're going to vote when it comes to the economy is to consider who are you hearing new and fresh ideas from? Who's talking about new industries? Who's talking about progressive technology? Who's talking about things that are going to be different, because we can't go into the future trying to just rebuild the past that we've come from.
Very interesting.
Well, a few economic potholes, we might say, thrown around in last night's leaders' debate. But of course, when we say leaders' debate, it's really just the leaders of the National Party and the Labour Party. And it's important, I think, in your voting to not just discount actually some of the economic thinking that's going on with some of those other smaller minor parties. So a couple of things that you might want to consider. If you haven't read or heard anything about Donut Economics, which is a book by Kat Rayworth, there's a really great podcast with James Shaw, who's the leader of the Greens Party, where he interviews her about this concept of donut economics, that however you design your economy, you have to design it within the bounds of whatever resource you have as a country.
Right.
And then if you picture a donut...
I know them very well.
The bounds, the bounds are the outside, right? So
Yeah.
those are the resources that you have, and the hole in the middle, that's where you want to make sure that nobody who's on the margins of society falls into that hole. So
Right.
that's how you should or could think about designing an economy. Great podcast, and worth thinking about if you want to stretch your thinking into some new and different ways of thinking about how to run the economy of a country.
And you were saying just before that that's probably what we need to do in order to see the economy successful. We need to be looking at ways that we can do it differently. And because we, the people, make up the economy, and also we vote for whoever's going to be leading our country. So we do have a lot of power.
Exactly.
You do find some of the more interesting economic ideas actually with the more minor parties, I feel, because Labour and National obviously are the two sort of mainstreamed large parties, and they kind of have their tried and true sort of ideas. I mean, it gets changes depending on who's currently in the party or whatnot, but they have their sort of their lane that they sort of stay in, and their big ideas. And they're quite both centrist, slightly left or right of that same thing. But then if you really want to see different ways of looking at it or ideas, if you start to look into some of the minor parties, you'll be like, oh, okay, that's... I was going to say left field, but you should be careful with those words around political stuff, shouldn't you?
Yes, well, it is really interesting to actually, because part of what happens is that people tend to stay in their lanes, right? And so then it's really easy for what happened in the leaders' debate last night to end up being the way that it goes, which is that it ends up being a debate about math, about whether or not the numbers add up in the same old kind of equations that we've had before. So if you consider that international tourism has been New Zealand's largest export product, it's bigger than dairy, it's bigger than wool, it's bigger than anything else that we send overseas. That has been a huge part of our economy, and this year the tap was turned off. And so if we keep thinking about things in the same old way and we don't start to actually generate new types of industry or new value out of those industries, we are going to get stuck. And if that means we have to break outside the box of the way that we have been thinking, then we've got to do that. Otherwise, the next big deal that comes along will be in the same situation.
Old solutions can't solve new problems.
Oh, profound.
Yeah, that's
I made that up
good.
myself just then. Put it on a mug. Come on. Every boss should have that as their mug.
Yeah, that's really good. Good way of thinking.
You'll need to cite me, though, if you use that in an essay for university. All right, so who are we hearing from here?
Okay, so we're gonna, as always, there's the left side, the right side, and then we're trying to muddle our way through the middle to figure out which way to go. The best way to do that is to try and think about the posture we need to assume. And so I spoke to our good friend, Reverend Frank Ritchie, about how we might posture ourselves as we come to thinking about the economy.
It's not like it was a question of, if we want the economy to thrive, we should just let COVID rip. I think we've seen around the world that's not the case, that would have hurt our economy as well, because it would have hurt the systems of people that are the economy, as you just pointed out. So that dichotomy has been a bad framing. And the fact that so many people have tried to make it health or economy has been completely unhelpful. There's entirely a balance going on, and I exist as a church minister whose congregation has actually done okay during this. We didn't see our income go down; it actually went up. But my wife runs a business, and that business didn't have income there for a while. And so we were really thankful for how quickly the government responded in its support and enabled that business to survive. And that business has thrived coming out of lockdown. We were really fortunate in that we didn't have to go into level 3, so we didn't have that issue. But I think people need to remove that dualistic thinking as they come to vote. It's not health or economy. Those two things are intertwined. And that goes with many issues. When we talk about something like tobacco, you could talk about the revenue that we gain from tobacco, but it actually costs us in terms of our health system as well. All of these things feed in together. People are the economy. So we need to take that into account as we come to vote. I think people are getting very and it's a symptom of our current culture, getting very tribalistic. And so they'll buy into one argument or the other rather than trying to find where that balance perspective is.
What about hyperinflation? We just do that. And then the debt is smaller because money's worth less. So, you got to be thinking sometimes with new ideas.
I think that's not the kind of lateral thinking we were hoping for, Bjorn. But
maybe not.
Good luck with that.
Heard it been tried before, but
yeah, I mean, it hasn't done any damage to the African continent at all, has it? No.
There's a few other examples around the place too.
Yes. But I think, as Frank said, in that there is something probably that you're going to hear a lot in the next 2 weeks, and it's going to be that question of who do you trust with the economy? Who do you trust with the economy? And I would say, hey, maybe counter that, switch up the perspective. It's maybe not a question of who do you trust, but actually who has ideas that can move us forward from this position,
Big questions. Lots to think about with this election. By the way, you can vote now if you want to. Voting is already open if you're registered, and if you're not, it's not too late. You can go sort yourself out and make sure that you actually get to have your say, because it is your election. You're part of democracy. You get a vote. We all get a vote. That's how it works.
You get a vote. We all get a vote.
It's Oprah. And you should, though. You should have your say, because everyone deserves to, and that's how a country works.
And the important thing to remember is that you can actually read the tax policies of every party that's currently up on the ballot. Just head to their websites or head to Policy NZ.
Tash McGill, thank you so much. Always a pleasure. When are you in next, and do we have a subject for next week?
Next Monday, 8 a.m, we are talking climate change.
Oh, very interesting. So Tash will be back with us on Monday, our political correspondent.